The morning I opened my bank account, every dollar was gone. I stared at the screen. I refreshed it, checked the account again. Nothing changed. My savings had disappeared. Then my phone rang. It was my daughter. Her wedding was the next day. She spoke calmly as if it were nothing at all. "Dad, I withdrew everything from your account, and I sold the house too. Good luck." Then the line went dead. I sat there holding the phone in silence, realizing she believed she had solved her problem, but she had no idea the chaos she had just unleashed. After the call ended, I didn't move. The house was silent, but my mind wasn't. I kept replaying her words, looking for a mistake, a misunderstanding, any sign that this wasn't real. No second call, no correction, just silence. She hadn't asked for help. She hadn't discussed it. She had decided for me. And that realization hurt more than the money itself. Not because of what she took, but because of how easily she believed I would accept it. My chest felt tight. My hands trembled slightly. I straightened my shoulders and took a slow breath. Panic wouldn't fix this. Anger wouldn't either. Only a clear plan would. And as I walked toward my desk, I understood something very clearly. If she thought this story ended with her announcement, she had no idea what was coming next. I sat at my desk and opened the laptop, not to react emotionally, to understand exactly what had happened. Confusion is dangerous. Clarity is power. I logged into the account again and scrolled through each transaction. I traced each timestamp with my finger on the screen. Every detail mattered now. Nothing looked accidental. Every transfer was clean, precise, too precise, cold, calculated. This wasn't a mistake made in panic. It was deliberate, planned. No alerts flashed, no red flags popped up. Everything was pristine, almost unnervingly perfect. They knew every move, every detail. And that realization changed everything, because this no longer felt random. It felt structured, which meant the real danger wasn't what I could see on the screen. It was what I still hadn't uncovered, the part they had already planned, but I hadn't yet seen. Before I did anything else, I leaned back in my chair and thought carefully about my next move. Acting in anger would only make things worse. Rushing without a plan could give her exactly what she expected, a confused father reacting emotionally. That wasn't going to happen. I reached for my phone and called the bank's fraud department, keeping my voice steady. I didn't accuse anyone. I simply requested a full security review of recent transactions and account access history. The representative confirmed the withdrawals were marked as authorized using valid credentials. That detail tightened my chest, and for a moment I felt the air leave my lungs. If the system saw it as legitimate, whoever did this had access beyond a guess. This wasn't random. It was deliberate. And if they thought I would quietly accept it, they had made a serious mistake, one that would soon cost them far more than they imagined. I hung up the phone and sat in silence for a few seconds, letting everything settle. The account had been accessed with valid credentials. This wasn't something I could fix with a quick complaint. It required a deeper response. I opened a new document and began recording every detail. The timestamps, the transactions, the phone call, the house sale, and her exact words. Every detail mattered. Memory fades. Records don't. Then I contacted an attorney I trusted, not to accuse anyone yet, but to understand my options. The conversation was short but clear. If property had been transferred without proper authorization, there were legal paths to challenge it. That was the first structured solution I had seen since that phone call. When I closed the laptop, one thing was certain. From this moment forward, every move would be intentional. If she believed she had control, she was about to discover what calm, relentless precision really looked like. That evening, I received a message from the wedding venue confirming final payments and guest arrangements. Seeing the date written so clearly on the screen reminded me how close everything was. Tomorrow wasn't just her wedding day, it was the deadline she had set without realizing it. I didn't respond to the venue directly, but I took note of the details, understanding how many moving parts were involved. Weddings require contracts, deposits, vendors, and confirmations. Nothing in a celebration of that size happens without paper trails, and paper trails can be examined. As I reviewed what little information I had, a quiet thought formed. If she had rushed this through using my account, there would be documentation somewhere that linked every step. That meant the situation wasn't only about emotion anymore. It was about structure, timing, and evidence. I closed the message and leaned back, knowing one thing for certain. The next 24 hours would determine everything. And by the time her wedding day arrived, the balance of control would look very different than she imagined. The next morning, I woke up earlier than usual. Not because I was restless, but because I had work to do. I reviewed everything again with a clear head, focusing on facts instead of emotions. If there were documents involved in the house transfer, there would be signatures, timestamps, and legal records connected to the process. I contacted the attorney once more to request immediate guidance on how to formally challenge any unauthorized property transaction. The tone of the conversation shifted from understanding options to preparing action. That distinction mattered. At the same time, I secured my remaining accounts, updating passwords and enabling every protection available. I wasn't reacting in panic, I was closing doors methodically. Each step reduced her ability to control the situation further. As I finished setting everything in place, I realized something important. She had expected confusion. She had expected shock. But what she was getting instead was preparation. And preparation, in a situation like this, changes outcomes. Tomorrow was her wedding day, but today was the day the foundation quietly began to shift. That afternoon, I decided it was time to confirm something important. I contacted the real estate office associated with the property records, asking for clarification about any recent transfer involving my name. I kept the conversation calm and factual, explaining that I was reviewing documentation and needed copies of anything bearing my signature. The response was professional, but what I heard next made the situation more serious. They confirmed that a transfer request had been submitted and that it had been processed through what appeared to be proper identification procedures. That detail changed everything again. It meant this wasn't just a casual mistake. Someone had gone through formal steps. As I thanked them and ended the call, I felt the weight of the situation grow, not because of fear, but because of clarity. Every action taken so far was deliberate, and deliberate actions leave traces. Now it was no longer about reacting to my daughter's words. It was about following the evidence wherever it led, no matter how uncomfortable that path might become. After ending the call, I sat quietly and thought about the timeline. The wedding was approaching quickly, and if any records had been filed, they would have a specific sequence, a date, a time, a verification trail. That meant everything could still be examined step by step. I opened my notes again and carefully organized what I now knew. separating confirmed facts from assumptions. Facts were powerful, assumptions were dangerous. As I reviewed the details, a new realization formed. Whoever had handled the transactions had likely counted on speed, quick decisions, emotional reactions, a father too shocked to respond properly. But I wasn't rushing. I was building a clear picture. And the clearer the picture became, the more one thing stood out. This had been prepared in advance, not just financially, but strategically, which meant the next move wouldn't be reactive, it would be deliberate. And tomorrow's celebration was getting closer by the hour. By the time evening arrived, I had gathered enough information to understand the direction of this situation, but not yet the full structure behind it. That uncertainty no longer felt like panic. It felt like a puzzle waiting to be completed. I returned to the documentation and reviewed every detail again, looking for patterns instead of emotions. Timing patterns, access patterns, any small inconsistency that might have been overlooked in the rush of the initial shock. The more carefully I examined everything, the clearer it became that this wasn't a spontaneous decision made hours before the wedding. It had the signs of planning, coordination, preparation, and confidence. Someone had believed they would not be questioned. That belief itself revealed something important. Because confidence in wrongdoing usually comes from thinking there will be no resistance. And as I closed the files for the night, I realized the next day would not simply be about a wedding. It would be about answers, and whoever had prepared this would soon discover that silence can turn into strategy very quickly. The next morning began differently, not with emotion, but with structure. I reviewed my notes again, this time focusing on sequence rather than shock. When events happen quickly, people often miss small details. But when you slow everything down, patterns begin to appear. I created a simple timeline on paper, placing each action in order: the bank access, the house transfer, the phone call, the attorney consultation. Seeing it visually made one thing clear. This wasn't random timing. It aligned too neatly with the wedding date. That connection mattered. If someone planned this around a public event, they expected distraction. Attention would be elsewhere. Guests would be arriving. Emotions would be high. That environment would make it harder to think clearly. But I was not inside that environment. I was observing it from a distance, and that distance gave me something valuable: perspective. As the morning moved forward, I understood that today would reveal more than she expected, because while she was preparing for celebration, I was preparing for clarity, and clarity always arrives quietly before it changes everything. As the wedding day continued approaching, I received a brief follow-up from the attorney confirming that formal action would depend on the documentation trail. That meant timing was critical. Evidence needed to be preserved properly, and any response had to follow the correct legal steps. I agreed to proceed exactly as advised, ensuring nothing was rushed or emotionally driven. While reviewing everything again, I noticed something important. The account access had occurred at a time when most people would assume I was either asleep or distracted. That detail reinforced the pattern. Whoever planned this understood routine. They understood timing. They understood expectations. That level of awareness suggested preparation, not impulse. And the more I studied the sequence, the more one thought became unavoidable. This wasn't just about taking money or property. It was about assuming I would remain silent. But silence, when used intentionally, can become a form of strength. And today, I intended to use it carefully. By midday, I made one more decision: I would not confront anyone emotionally before I had complete clarity. Confrontation without facts only creates noise, and noise benefits the person trying to hide something. Instead, I continued gathering documentation, requesting certified copies where necessary, and confirming every detail through official channels. The process was slower than reacting, but it was stronger. Each verified document added weight to my understanding of the situation. The evidence was beginning to form a consistent picture, and consistency is difficult to fake over time. As the afternoon light entered the room, I felt something shift inside me. Not anger, not fear, but resolve. This was no longer about being surprised. It was about being prepared. And as the hours moved closer to the ceremony, I realized the real turning point would not come from a dramatic argument. It would come from timing. Because when the right information meets the right moment, control changes hands quietly. As the wedding ceremony drew nearer, I received confirmation that copies of the relevant records would be available shortly. That meant everything was moving forward in an organized way, step by step. I reviewed my timeline again and noticed how tightly everything aligned with the wedding schedule. The financial changes, the property transfer, the calls, all positioned around the same period. That alignment no longer felt coincidental. It felt structured. And structure suggests intention. While others would see today as a celebration, I saw it as a critical moment in a larger sequence. I remained calm, avoiding any emotional contact that could distort the process. Instead, I focused on precision, making sure every document, every record, and every detail was secured. Because once facts are officially recorded, they cannot easily be rewritten. And as the clock continued toward the ceremony time, I understood something clearly. The next phase would not depend on emotion. It would depend on preparation, meeting opportunity at exactly the right second. As the ceremony time approached, I noticed my phone remained unusually quiet. No follow-up message, no attempt to explain. That silence itself was telling. When someone believes they have successfully taken control, they often stop checking for resistance. They assume the situation is settled. I used that silence to my advantage, continuing to stay composed and observant rather than reactive. Meanwhile, I reviewed the documentation trail once more, making sure every detail was properly saved and organized. If this situation escalated, clarity would matter more than emotion. The venue schedule confirmed that guests would begin arriving soon. That meant attention would soon shift towards celebration. And when attention shifts, people tend to overlook details in the background. I understood that dynamic well. Today was structured around ceremony and emotion, but underneath that surface there was a different timeline unfolding. And when those two timelines intersect, the outcome can change instantly. I was ready for that moment. By late afternoon, I decided it was time to review one final element before anything unfolded at the venue. I contacted the attorney again to confirm the exact legal steps required if we needed to formally dispute the property transfer. The response was steady and clear. Everything would depend on documented proof, verified identity procedures, and the official sequence of events. That confirmation reinforced my focus. I wasn't going to argue emotionally. I was going to respond procedurally. Procedures are powerful because they operate on facts, not feelings. After ending the call, I checked the time. Guests would soon begin gathering. That realization didn't create panic, it created awareness. Large public events often distract people from details happening elsewhere. But I was no longer thinking like someone caught off guard. I was thinking like someone preparing for alignment. making sure that when the right moment arrived, I would already be in position. And as the hour moved closer to the ceremony, I understood that the next development would determine the direction of everything that followed. As the ceremony time grew closer, I received a brief notification confirming that the requested document copies were ready for review. That was important. Having official records in hand would allow everything to move forward in a structured way. I arranged to collect them immediately, ensuring there would be no delay in accessing the information if it became necessary. While preparing to leave, I took one last look at my notes. The timeline was now complete, and the sequence of events was clear. Nothing about it felt accidental. The timing, the access, the coordination all pointed toward intention, and intention can be examined. As I stepped outside, the air felt different, not because of emotion, but because of anticipation. Today was not about confrontation, it was about readiness. Somewhere across town, preparations for a wedding were underway. But here, in my quiet focus, another kind of preparation was reaching its final stage, one built on documentation, patience, and precision. And when the two worlds finally intersected, the results would depend on who had prepared more carefully. When I arrived to collect the documents, I reviewed them carefully before leaving the office. Every page mattered. I checked names, dates, signatures, and verification marks with steady attention. The records confirmed what had been explained earlier. The transfer process had followed formal procedures on the surface. That detail made the situation more complex, not less. Complexity requires patience. I made additional copies and secured them properly, ensuring nothing could be misplaced. As I left the building, I felt no rush. Rushing would serve no purpose now. The wedding ceremony would soon begin, and with it, attention would be focused on celebration. But I understood something important. Major decisions often happen in the quiet moments surrounding public events, not in the spotlight itself. And today, quiet preparation was my strength. The next step would depend entirely on timing. And timing, in situations like this, can determine everything. As the ceremony time approached, I took a moment to review the full sequence one final time. The documents were secure. The timeline was organized. The legal guidance was clear. Everything now depended on how events unfolded in the coming hours. I did not intend to create a scene. Public confrontations rarely solve problems. They only amplify them. Instead, I chose to remain calm and observant. Weddings move quickly once they begin, with guests arriving, vendors coordinating, and schedules shifting. That activity can create openings, moments where attention is divided. I understood that dynamic well. If there were any remaining irregularities in the property or financial records, they would surface through formal review, not emotion. And as I prepared to move forward, I realized something quietly powerful. The advantage no longer belonged to whoever acted first. It belonged to whoever stayed steady the longest. And today, steadiness was on my side. By the time the ceremony officially began, I was no longer thinking about shock or anger. I was thinking about sequence. Events follow order, and order can be analyzed. I reviewed my documents once more, ensuring everything was properly stored and accessible if needed. The venue lights, guest arrivals, and music signals all indicated that the celebration was now in motion. From the outside, everything would appear normal, joyful even. But I understood that appearances and reality are not always aligned. Somewhere in that building, decisions had been made based on assumptions about me, assumptions that I would be too overwhelmed to respond effectively. That assumption itself was the vulnerability. Because when someone underestimates you, they often reveal more than they intend. As I approached the venue area, remaining composed and unhurried, I reminded myself of one thing. This was not about disruption. It was about resolution. And resolution would come at the right moment, not before, not after, but exactly when it mattered most. As guests gathered and conversations filled the air, I stayed slightly apart from the crowd, observing quietly rather than drawing attention. The atmosphere was focused on celebration, and that focus was understandable. Weddings are emotional milestones. But beneath that surface, I remained aware of the underlying situation. I had ensured that all relevant documents were secure and that my legal guidance was aligned with the timeline. Everything was positioned carefully. No sudden moves, no emotional reactions, just readiness. From a distance, I could see the structure of the event, the coordination, the timing, the expectations. And within that structure, I recognized an opportunity. Large events create predictable rhythms. When people believe everything is settled, they relax. That relaxation can reveal important details. I was not there to interrupt anything prematurely. I was there to observe, to confirm, and to act only if the facts required it. Because in moments like this, patience is not weakness. It is strategy. And strategy, when applied correctly, changes outcomes quietly but completely. As the ceremony preparations intensified, I noticed a subtle shift in the environment. Staff moving with increased urgency, guests being guided toward their seats, final confirmations being made. Everything followed a structured sequence. That structure reminded me again how important timing is in any complex situation. Meanwhile, I remained calm and composed, ensuring that my documentation was accessible and that my attorney was aware of the current stage of events. No confrontation had occurred yet, and that was intentional. Acting too early would only create unnecessary noise. Instead, I continued observing the flow of the day, watching how attention naturally centered on the bride and groom. Public focus can be powerful, but it can also create blind spots. And if there were any remaining steps in the property or financial process that required clarification, they would surface through official channels, not emotion. As the ceremony was about to begin, I understood that the next significant moment would not come from words. It would come from information meeting timing at precisely the right instant. As the ceremony began, the room grew quiet and attention shifted fully toward the front of the venue. From my position, I observed without interrupting, allowing events to unfold naturally. Everything appeared polished and carefully arranged, just as expected for a day of this importance. But I remained focused on the underlying structure, not the surface presentation. My documents were secure, my legal guidance was in place, and my timeline was clear. That preparation gave me confidence, not the loud kind, but the steady kind that comes from knowing you have followed every proper step. Meanwhile, the ceremony proceeded according to plan, with guests watching and cameras ready. In moments like this, most people are thinking about emotions and memories. I was thinking about verification and sequence. Because when formal processes intersect with carefully timed actions, the outcome can shift quickly. And as the vows were about to be spoken, I recognized that whatever happened next would depend entirely on the groundwork that had already been laid in silence. As the vows began, I stayed calm and observant, listening without reacting. The ceremony carried the expected emotions, smiles, quiet attention, the sense of significance that comes with such a public commitment. But beneath that atmosphere, I remained aware of the larger situation. Every official document connected to the property and financial changes had been organized and reviewed. Nothing was left unexamined. That preparation mattered now more than ever. Large events often create the illusion that everything is settled, but in reality, important details can still be clarified through proper channels. I reminded myself that the goal was not disruption, it was accountability. If any step in the process had been handled improperly, the records would reveal it. And records do not change based on emotion. As the ceremony continued, I felt a quiet certainty growing inside me. The next decisive moment would not come from confrontation, but from confirmation. And confirmation was already in motion. As the ceremony moved toward its final moments, I received a discreet notification confirming that the documents I had requested were now fully available for formal review. That detail mattered. It meant the evidence trail was complete and properly archived. I stepped slightly aside from the main gathering area and reviewed the materials once more, focusing on clarity rather than emotion. Everything had been documented in sequence: access times, authorization records, and procedural confirmations. The structure of the transactions could now be examined in full context. I did not need to rush. The legal process would follow its own timeline, independent of the celebration happening nearby. That separation was important. One timeline was emotional and public. The other was procedural and factual. And when those two timelines intersect, facts usually carry more weight than feelings. As the ceremony approached its conclusion, I understood that whatever decision was required next would be guided entirely by evidence, not surprise, not anger, and not assumptions. As the ceremony reached its final formal moments, I remained composed and attentive, waiting for the right point in the schedule. Timing was essential now. If action became necessary, it would need to align with the completion of official proceedings, ensuring everything remained structured and clear. I reviewed the documentation again briefly, confirming that all copies were secure and that my attorney was prepared to proceed if required. Nothing about my approach was emotional. It was measured. In situations like this, discipline matters more than impulse. Meanwhile, the celebration continued. Guests focused on the event unfolding at the front of the venue. From their perspective, it was a normal wedding day. From mine, it was a carefully observed sequence of steps leading toward resolution. I understood something important. When preparation is thorough, you do not need to raise your voice. You simply need to act at the correct moment. And that moment was approaching steadily, guided not by drama, but by precision. As the ceremony concluded and guests began transitioning toward the reception area, I remained calm and deliberate. The formal part of the event was complete, and attention was shifting toward celebration, photographs, greetings, and conversations. That shift created movement, and movement often reveals details that static moments conceal. I used that transition to quietly confirm my next steps with the attorney, ensuring everything was ready if formal action needed to begin. The guidance was consistent: follow procedure, rely on documentation, and avoid emotional confrontation. That advice aligned perfectly with my approach. I had no intention of disrupting the event. My focus was accountability, not spectacle. Meanwhile, I observed how confidently the day continued, as if nothing else existed beyond the celebration. That confidence was telling. People who believe a situation is finalized often lower their guard. And when guard comes down, clarity becomes easier to establish. As the reception atmosphere grew louder, I understood that the next phase would not depend on public attention. It would depend on the quiet strength of well-prepared facts. As the reception area filled with music and conversation, I positioned myself where I could observe without drawing attention. The transition from ceremony to celebration created natural movement throughout the venue, and with that movement came opportunities for information to surface. I checked my phone briefly, confirming that all documentation remained securely stored and accessible. Everything was in order. There was no urgency in my actions, only readiness. Around me, guests were smiling, taking photos, and offering congratulations. From their perspective, the day was progressing normally. But I remained aware that major decisions are often influenced by what happens behind the scenes, not in front of an audience. If any part of the property transfer or financial authorization required review, it would now move through official channels with full documentation supporting it. That awareness gave me confidence, because confidence grounded in preparation is different from confidence built on assumption. And as the reception continued, I understood that the next meaningful development would emerge not from noise, but from the structured process already underway. As the reception progressed, I received a confirmation message from the attorney indicating that the preliminary review of the documents had been completed. The next step, if we chose to proceed, would involve formally requesting verification of the identification procedures used during the transfers. That information could determine whether the process followed proper authorization standards. Hearing that gave the situation even more structure. This was no longer speculation, it was becoming procedural. I acknowledged the message and remained composed, understanding that any formal action would need to align carefully with timing. Meanwhile, the celebration continued around me, completely unaware of the parallel process unfolding quietly in the background. That contrast was striking. One side of the day focused on emotion and ceremony. The other focused on documentation and verification. And when those two worlds eventually intersect, clarity tends to decide the outcome. As the reception entered its next phase, I felt steady and prepared, knowing that every move from this point forward would be deliberate, documented, and precise. As the reception settled into its rhythm, I took a moment to step away from the crowd and review everything once more in quiet focus. The attorney's guidance was clear and the documentation was organized. The timeline of events had been preserved carefully, and that preservation mattered. In situations involving property and financial access, sequence and proof carry significant weight. I understood that any formal challenge would depend entirely on verified records, not emotion or assumptions. Meanwhile, the atmosphere in the venue remained celebratory, with speeches beginning and guests gathering attention toward the front. I observed calmly, ensuring that I remained aligned with the legal process rather than reacting to anything happening publicly. Preparation had always been my priority, and now, with the evidence secured and the guidance confirmed, I felt confident that if action became necessary, it would be supported by structure and clarity. As the evening continued, one thing remained certain. Whatever unfolded next would depend on facts, and facts were already on my side. As the reception moved into the next stage, I noticed the energy in the room shift slightly. Speeches were being prepared, attention gathering toward the center again. Public moments like this often bring heightened emotion, but I remained focused on the underlying process. The documentation was secure, the timeline complete, and the attorney fully informed. Nothing was being left to chance. If formal verification of the property transfer became necessary, it would follow proper channels, step by step. That structure gave me steady confidence. Around me, guests continued celebrating, unaware of the detailed review taking place quietly in parallel. That separation between celebration and procedure was intentional on my part. I was not there to create disruption. I was there to ensure accuracy. And accuracy, once established through official records, becomes difficult to challenge. As the evening progressed, I understood that the next development would not come from emotion. It would come from information reaching its proper conclusion at exactly the right time. During a brief pause in the reception program, I received an updated message from the attorney confirming that a formal inquiry could be initiated immediately if I approved it. The request would involve verifying the identification trail connected to the account access and reviewing the procedural details behind the property transfer. This was the point where preparation transitioned into action. Not emotional action, structured action. I took a moment to consider the timing carefully. With the event still in progress, any official process would need to be handled through appropriate channels to maintain clarity and professionalism. That approach aligned with everything I had done so far. Meanwhile, the celebration continued, completely unaware of the administrative steps moving forward quietly behind the scenes. That contrast reinforced something important. Outcomes are rarely decided by noise. They are decided by documentation, sequence, and precision. And as I confirmed the next step with steady focus, I understood that the situation was now entering its final phase of review. As the reception continued, I decided it was time to prepare for the possibility that formal action might begin soon. I reviewed all documents one final time, ensuring every copy was properly stored and that nothing could be questioned about its authenticity or timeline. The attorney's guidance remained clear. If we proceeded, the inquiry would focus strictly on verification and procedural integrity. That level of structure was important. Around me, the celebration carried on with speeches and laughter, but I stayed grounded and attentive. I was no longer reacting to what had happened earlier. I was positioned for what could happen next. If there were irregularities in how the transfer or authorization occurred, they would now face structured review. And structured review does not depend on emotion. It depends on evidence. As the evening lights brightened the venue, I felt a quiet certainty building. Every step I had taken was deliberate, and every document was ready. The situation was now aligned for resolution, and resolution tends to arrive exactly when preparation meets opportunity. As the evening progressed, I received confirmation that the formal inquiry process had been initiated through the appropriate channels. That message changed the tone of the situation, not publicly, but procedurally. It meant the documentation would now be reviewed independently, following established verification standards. I felt calm as I read the update because everything had been handled carefully from the beginning. No emotional statements, no rushed accusations, only facts and records. Meanwhile, the reception continued, guests unaware of the structured process now underway. That separation between celebration and investigation felt intentional and balanced. If any irregularity existed in the account access or property transfer, it would now be evaluated according to official standards. And official standards operate on evidence, not assumptions. As the night moved forward, I understood that the next development would likely emerge from that review, and when it did, the outcome would depend entirely on what the records revealed. As the reception began winding down, I noticed guests gradually shifting toward departures and final conversations. The formal celebration was nearing its conclusion, which meant the structured parts of the day were coming to an end. That timing aligned with the process now unfolding through official channels. I remained composed, avoiding unnecessary interaction and focusing only on clarity. The inquiry, once initiated, would follow its own timeline, independent of the event. That independence mattered. It ensured that emotion would not influence verification. I checked my phone one more time, confirming that all documents were still securely stored and accessible. Everything was in order. No gaps, no missing details. The foundation was solid. As the evening air cooled outside the venue, I felt steady and prepared. Whatever the formal review determined, I was ready to respond appropriately. The situation was no longer about surprise. It was about structure. And structure, once activated, tends to move forward until the truth becomes visible. As the night grew quieter and the reception space began to empty, I remained composed, observing the final moments of the event from a calm distance. The celebration was transitioning into its closing phase, with guests exchanging goodbyes and staff beginning to reset the venue. Meanwhile, the formal inquiry process continued independently in the background. I did not need to interfere with it. The records would speak for themselves. That confidence came from preparation, from documenting every detail and ensuring the timeline was clear. If any step in the account access or property transfer required clarification, it would now be reviewed under structured verification standards. And structured verification does not rely on emotion or assumptions. It relies on documented evidence. As I stood near the exit, I understood something important. This day had begun with shock, but it was ending with control. And control, when built on facts and patience, often leads to outcomes far different from what was originally expected. As the venue lights dimmed and the last guests gradually left, I stayed a few extra moments, reflecting quietly on everything that had unfolded. The wedding itself had followed its planned course, but beneath the surface, a separate process had been set in motion. The formal inquiry was now active, and the documentation was under review. That meant the situation would be evaluated based on evidence rather than emotion. I felt steady knowing that every step I had taken was recorded and organized properly. There had been no impulsive decisions, no public accusations, only careful preparation. That discipline mattered. Now the outcome would depend on verified records and procedural standards. If irregularities were identified, they would surface through the official review. And if everything proved valid, that clarity would also be valuable. Either way, the truth would emerge through structure. As I stepped outside into the quiet night, I understood that this chapter was nearing its resolution, not through confrontation, but through confirmation. Later that evening, I received a brief update indicating that the verification process had reached its initial review stage. The authorities handling the inquiry were examining the authorization trail connected to the account activity and property transfer. That confirmation meant the process was moving forward properly. I did not attempt to influence it or accelerate it. The strength of this approach was patience. Everything had been submitted in order, with timestamps and supporting documentation intact. As I sat quietly at home, I felt no urge to call anyone or argue. The evidence would stand on its own. Meanwhile, the wedding day that had begun with celebration was now officially over. Guests had returned to their routines. The event had concluded. But the procedural review was still active. And when formal processes begin, they continue until they reach a conclusion. I understood that completely. Whatever the final determination would be, it would come from facts, and facts have a way of becoming undeniable when examined carefully. The following morning, I received confirmation that additional details were being requested as part of the verification review. That meant the inquiry was progressing beyond the initial stage. Supporting documents would be examined more closely, and the authorization pathway would be analyzed in full context. I felt steady reading the update because everything I had prepared was organized and complete. There were no missing records, no unclear timestamps, no gaps in the timeline. That level of preparation ensured transparency. As I reviewed the message, I realized something important. The process was no longer just about confirming events. It was about validating structure. And structure, once evaluated properly, reveals whether procedures were followed exactly as required. Meanwhile, the day after the wedding felt quieter. Life was returning to normal on the surface, but underneath that surface, the formal review continued methodically. And I knew that when official verification reaches its final stage, clarity becomes unavoidable. By the second day after the wedding, I noticed a significant shift in tone from the ongoing verification process. The review team had requested a complete reconstruction of the authorization sequence, meaning every step taken during the account access and property transfer would be examined in order. That level of detail confirmed that the matter was being treated seriously and professionally. I responded promptly with all requested materials, ensuring full cooperation. There was no hesitation in my approach, only transparency. As the documentation moved through deeper analysis, I felt a quiet sense of reassurance. Everything I had done was aligned with procedure. Nothing had been rushed or altered. Meanwhile, the public celebration was now just a memory, but the formal process continued independently. And that independence was important, because when structured reviews examine timelines carefully, inconsistencies either appear clearly or they don't. Either result would provide clarity. And clarity, after everything that had happened, was exactly what I intended to achieve. A few days later, I received a formal update confirming that the verification review had identified discrepancies in the authorization trail. The message was written in careful, professional language, but the meaning was clear. Certain procedural elements required further clarification before the transfers could remain fully validated. Reading that notice, I felt calm rather than surprised. The purpose of documentation is to reveal truth when examined thoroughly, and that process was now doing exactly what it was designed to do. I immediately confirmed that I was available to provide any additional information needed. There was no need for confrontation. The records would guide the outcome. Meanwhile, I reflected on how the entire situation had unfolded, beginning with shock, moving through investigation, and now reaching formal review. The sequence had always depended on patience and structure. And as I closed the message, I understood something important. The foundation of this case was no longer assumption, it was evidence. And evidence, once fully evaluated, leads to conclusions that cannot be ignored. Following the latest update, I was informed that the verification process had progressed to a detailed audit stage. That meant independent specialists would now examine the full timeline of authorization, including identity validation records and procedural confirmations. This was the phase where everything becomes precise. I remained cooperative and available, providing any supplementary documentation immediately upon request. There was no urgency in my actions, only consistency. As the audit continued, I thought about how quickly assumptions can form in emotional moments and how slowly truth is uncovered through structured review. The contrast between those two approaches had defined this entire situation. One relied on speed and confidence, the other relied on patience and verification. And now the verification path was moving forward steadily. Whatever conclusions emerged would be based on formal findings, not opinions. That understanding gave me complete clarity. Because once an audit reaches this level, outcomes are determined strictly by documented facts. And facts, when confirmed, reshape situations permanently. As the audit progressed, I received confirmation that preliminary findings were being compiled for final evaluation. The tone of the communication remained professional and neutral, but it indicated that the evidence trail was now fully under structured review. I reviewed my copies one more time, ensuring that everything I had submitted matched the official timestamps exactly. There were no inconsistencies on my end. That reassurance allowed me to remain calm throughout the process. Meanwhile, daily life around me continued as usual, yet internally, this situation had already entered its resolution phase. Formal systems operate independently once activated, and their conclusions depend entirely on recorded data. I did not attempt to influence the outcome or contact anyone outside proper channels. The strength of my position came from documentation and patience. And as I waited for the final determination, I understood that whatever decision emerged would be grounded in verified records, bringing this chapter closer to a definitive and structured conclusion. Eventually, I received notification that the audit had reached its conclusion stage. The review team had completed its examination of the authorization sequence and the property transfer timeline. What followed was not dramatic, it was procedural. The findings were summarized clearly, outlining which elements met verification standards and which required correction or reversal through official channels. Reading the document, I felt a calm sense of closure beginning to form. Everything had unfolded exactly as it should in a structured system: review, evaluation, and determination. I carefully saved the final report and shared it with my attorney for the next steps. There was no need for confrontation or public display. The process itself had delivered clarity. And as I reflected on the entire journey, from the moment I saw the empty account to the completion of the audit, I realized something important. Patience, documentation, and steady action had transformed shock into resolution. The outcome now rested on verified conclusions, and those conclusions would guide whatever followed next. In the days that followed, everything moved through the final official procedures based on the audit's conclusions. The necessary corrections were handled through the proper channels, and the records were updated accordingly. There was no confrontation, no public argument, only structured resolution. What began as a moment of shock had transitioned into a documented process that ended with clarity. Sitting quietly at home one evening, I reflected on how easily panic could have changed the outcome. If I had reacted emotionally, the situation might have escalated in a completely different direction. Instead, patience and preparation guided every step. The experience reminded me that control does not come from loud reactions. It comes from steady decisions made with evidence in hand. As I closed my files for the final time, I felt a sense of completion. The storm, the confusion, and the uncertainty had passed, and in their place stood something far more powerful: truth confirmed, records aligned, and a reminder that calm precision can restore balance even in the most unexpected situations.